I'm very glad to be with you all and to have this opportunity. We have with us Ben Boswell, who is the pastor of Myers Park Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, and a Doctor of Ministry grad from St. Paul, actually less than a year ago. He graduated in May of 2020. So Ben, welcome. We're really glad to have you here with us today and to share something about your work.
Yeah, I'm really pleased to be here. It's a tremendous honor for me to spend some time with you all and share what I'm doing, and glad to be here with Dr. Brandt. Also, I see another one of my professors, Dr. Sigmund's here. So just glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So Ben is going to share some of the work he did for his Doctor of Ministry degree, which he earned last year. Ben, tell us a little bit about what it was like to receive that honor from the city of Charlotte.
Breathtaking, truly humbling. I really was a little lost for words, which is a hard thing for a preacher, I think. And to be recognized by my colleagues, Black pastors and leaders who are the people who vote for that award, and civic leaders for the work that I've been doing, it really was just breathtaking. I never did anything that I was doing for any accolades. In fact, I used to joke with myself that I had to always wake up remembering that no one is going to thank me for doing the right thing. And I should never be expecting thanks for doing the right thing and for doing what I'm called to do. And so it's just all grace to receive anything like that.
So Ben, I'm going to ask you to talk about the work that you did at St. Paul as part of your Doctor of Ministry, and how the work that you did for your DMin then fed into the anti-racism work that you did. Really, a lot of it was spurred on by the murder of George Floyd, I know.
Yeah, so before George Floyd's murder, back during the doctoral work, I was struggling with a question of why predominantly white churches that I had led had not been making any progress on their involvement in the movement for racial justice. And I serve predominantly white, often affluent churches in the Baptist tradition, but the churches that I've served in the Baptist tradition are not Southern Baptist, but very progressive Baptist, Alliance of Baptists, American Baptist churches. And I've noticed the same pattern over and over again in my own ministry, which was that something would happen in the world. Often a Black person, unarmed, would be killed by police, and the church would want to talk about race again. And I would do my best as a pastor to try to lead the church in that conversation. And as I did that, though, I found that the conversations rarely went anywhere. They were often shallow and lacked any transformative impact on the congregation, and they would kind of go away for a while, and then something else would happen and we'd start all over again. And I kept wondering, what is it that is the impediment here? And so that's what I embarked on to try to discover in my work at St. Paul's, in the doctoral work, as well as I was in a program that was a joint program with the Academy for Spiritual Formation. And I was really grateful for that spiritual experience because I needed the time in prayer and silence to see what my role was as a part of the impediment. So part of what I discovered was that I was part of the reason why these conversations weren't going anywhere, because of the way I was approaching them with the congregation, and because of my own colorblind racist ideology that I had come to, and my inability to take responsibility for my own whiteness. And it was really whiteness and the discovery of my own whiteness and the discovery of the lack of Christian theological reflection on whiteness, particularly by white religious scholars and white Christian scholars, and the lack of the church, particularly white dominant churches, ever talking about what it means to be white and or facing and confronting whiteness, that helped me to begin to imagine how to develop this project that I did develop. I would also want to say that my role as a white pastor of predominantly white churches was also being informed by being a father of an adopted Black daughter in this particular moment in American history. So my daughter's entire life is in the time frame of when the new Jim Crow was published by Michelle Alexander, and the Black Lives Matter movement began in America. And we've seen this racial awakening happening, and the resurgence of white supremacy, and the election recently, and all the political things around this. And so it's those things informing one another, trying to pastor and father in that moment has really led me to this process. It required a lot of spiritual work personally, I think, not just academic work, to get to the point where I could see myself. And what the gift for me was beginning to learn how to see myself through the eyes of people of color who have been writing about what white people have been doing and what white people look like for hundreds of years. And so that was really the foundation of how I developed my project, which was a combination of critical race theory, and by that, a subset of critical race theory, critical whiteness studies, and putting that as the theoretical foundation with Black liberation thinkers in the Christian tradition, James Cone, Willie Jennings, Kelly Brown Douglas, in conversation together on the topic of whiteness and what is whiteness, and then as the sort of theoretical and theological foundation, and then to develop a project to see if we could work with a small groups of people within a white dominant church to confront whiteness, to see whiteness, to identify it. So that's how I began to build out this project with the help of my advisor and classes that I had been taking as I went along the way, which all books that I was reading all were informing this process. And I wanted to develop something that was a combination of spiritual formation and anti-racist training. There are a lot of anti-racist trainings. There's a lot of spiritual formation things. There's not as many things that combine the two together and try to create an environment where you can be doing both that. Intentionally created a small group model with spiritual practices, including mindfulness, meditation practices, and other practices to kind of set the stage for the anti-racist work we were going to do.
So thank you, Ben. That's really helpful. So talk about the actual project, and maybe even starting with the recruiting of folks, and then the 7-week project that you did and how it worked.
Yeah. So I started by recruiting people in the congregation who had, in the course of my tenure there, come up to me and asked me strange questions about race. And folks who had approached me to have conversations about racism or what we were doing as a church on that. And so that's where I started, sort of a selected invitation. And we ended up with 11 participants in the first one, which is was a little large, but it worked out. And then the process was to build a curriculum that they would then read of authors, starting with folks like W.E.B. Du Bois and James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Bell Hooks, Willie Jennings, Kelly Brown Douglas. And I'd really tried to do two things at the same time, which was to elevate the average lay person's involvement to the point where it was almost like a master's level course for a lot of them in some cases, but at the same time to keep things accessible so that they wouldn't fall apart and everything would be over their head. And also to work really hard to make sure that we were talking about emotions and feelings and not just thinking and doing a lot of brains on a stick thing. So we started with a 3-hour retreat at the beginning and a 3-hour retreat at the very end, and then 7 weeks in the middle. And the retreat was focused around what I called a racial autobiography. I invited every participant to write the story of race in their life, beginning with their first memories of race and all the way to as when they can. And this was a living document that they would continue to write as we went through the process together. This turned out to be maybe the most important spiritual practice that we engaged in throughout the entire journey, because then those stories became the seeds of their confessions, which was a part of our weekly session, the seeds of their acknowledgments of whiteness as we went through. So then at the retreat, after the retreat, where we shared all of our racial autobiographies, then we would have our first session, and each session was focused on a different aspect of whiteness. So whiteness as property, whiteness as evil, or whiteness as mythology, whiteness as principality, all centered around the language given to whiteness by a person of color who's writing, a theorist and intellectual, Malcolm X, Baldwin, W.E.B. Du Bois, Toni Morrison, and looking at whiteness through their eyes, looking at ourselves, really putting up the mirror, allowing ourselves to look in the mirror that they create, and spending time reflecting on it. And then we would come into each session and we would start with meditation and silence. And then we would have what I called 3-minute rounds. Each person got to share the answer to the question, how did this reading make you feel? What was most impactful for you? And what are you discovering about whiteness? And they had to share it in 3 minutes. And I timed everybody. When they got to end of 3 minutes, they had to stop. And no one was allowed to respond to anyone else in the group except to say thank you. So you're only allowed to say thank you. Someone went on a racist tirade, you just said thank you at the end. Someone said something deeply profound about whiteness, we just said thank you. And then, so now everybody was in the room, and then we would have, after that, a facilitated group discussion about the readings that we watched together. And then we would repeat that every week for 7 more weeks. And then we came back together at the end for kind of a close-up session where we talked again about our racial autobiographies. I asked the participants to write them over again, attending to what they discovered about whiteness in the course. So like, for example, a lot of people started out by saying, the first time I saw a Black person was, and would tell us the story of that when they first wrote it. And in the end, after they rewrote it, they would write, my parents taught me how to be white by. So that was the kind of shift that I saw happening in the participants that went through the process. There was a whole lot of other shifts that happened through the process as well. It was dramatic for a lot. I would say that the common refrain for many was that they felt an existential crisis at many points throughout the process, especially when they were having to wrestle with Malcolm X, for instance, especially the week when we talked about whiteness as terror or terrorizing in the Black imagination. Most white people have never imagined themselves as terrorizing or terrorists in the eyes of Black people. And so that was a real profound crisis for a lot. That what happened though is that the circle itself and the fact that we were together in a small group and they were all with one another in this accountability place, it was hard for folks to abdicate responsibility, and it was also easier for folks to work through it together because they knew they were doing it with other people and not alone in this journey. And so the group became this sort of support group in a lot of ways. And we were almost doing narrative therapy at points where we're dissecting each other's stories, which start to become each other's gifts and formative practices. So that's a little bit about, and then at the end of every session, I would hold a couple minutes for people to make confessions and acknowledgements of whiteness at the end of each session. So as Dr. Brandt mentioned, I defended my dissertation April 23rd or something like that. And then a month later, George Floyd was killed, and some things transpired here in the city that made me feel really deeply called to go ahead and just start leading these groups for the community and for our church. Even though they were not really ready, there had not been a book published, it was not well polished. It was just, I just felt like we needed to do it. And now we've had over 300 participants. We've had about 27 groups since George Floyd's murder. I now have 25 other trained facilitators that I have gone through the process and that I have trained who are now leading groups. At this moment today, we have 11 groups happening at the same time, both in our church and in the community. And it has been a real transformative process.
Did you experience resistance along the way to what you were doing, either from people in the groups or people outside in the congregation or in the larger Charlotte community?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the group, in the sessions, obviously people react strongly to being called a white devil by Malcolm X. That's not something folks easily get over. And you know, I don't think most white folks have not spent a lot of time even reading Malcolm X, right? Let alone sitting with for an entire week, being called a white devil and trying to wrestle with that spiritually. I mean, that's a different kind of experience. And then to do so in community with other people in your church. So what happens is a lot of racial stress occurs in the course of the process. And, you know, there's a lot of writings now about white fragility, Robin DiAngelo and others writing on white fragility, white rage, white backlash, white victimization was one we experienced a lot, where white people start to play the victim. Aren't we the victim of affirmative action? Aren't we now the victims of history? All those reactions occurred in the process for almost every participant. And they have also occurred in my context as we were trying to do this, and in the city, and among other religious leaders as this has transpired. One of the events that led to me feeling the need to do these was that a number of clergy in the city wanted to respond to the murder of George Floyd, and all the white clergy got together to write a statement. And I asked them if I said, well, I think we need to include, condemnation of systemic racism and white supremacy in this statement. And they would not include that in the statement for fear that they would not only lose some of the clergy who are going to sign on the statement, but that they would lose face in their own congregations with their own lay leaders. And so I just said, I won't sign it. And then it went out to the public without my name on it, which then I had to explain to my members. And so, they were mad that my name was not there with the clergy, all the other clergy. But the statement basically said, something very bland, like, we see you, we're hurting for you, we'll try to be better. Like it was just the whitest statement ever, and so whitewashed. And so I just think this work that I did at St. Paul's, and then writing the doctoral thesis and then aftermath of that, just made me feel like I could not sign that with integrity anymore. And unless people were willing to acknowledge whiteness, I couldn't be a part of that kind of just performative allyship, is what I would see that as at this point. So anyway, so that then led me to say, well, don't sign this statement, let's do a group. And I did get some evangelical pastors to go through one of the first groups that I did, which was really interesting. And have had a number of clergy, Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, go through the process. I've done some work now at an Episcopal school. I've led the Alliance of Baptist staff through it. I'm leading the upper room staff through the process right now. I'm working with a number of churches that are doing processes, wanting to go through the process. So yeah, I mean, a lot has come out of it since then, but the resistance is constant, and there's still resistance. Even people who go through the process and come out, not everybody is like converted, maybe is the word to say. Some still really wonder, is it really all whiteness? Is whiteness really the thing? Or is there something else that I should be worried about and working on or fighting against? Or and then others will say, does this distract from the economic critique? Although I have a whole section on the economics of whiteness, but like, is it too much? Are we still focusing too much on race? Are we centering whiteness by talking about whiteness? So there's a lot of interesting critiques that come up that are not all based in racial stress, but there's definitely the racial stress too.
So Ben, I think you've done some things to find ways to have your work be accountable, and to be accountable in some ways to the African-American community, or at least representatives. Can you talk about that piece of your work and why you thought it was important?
Yeah, this actually, in the summer after the murder of George Floyd, I asked some local activists to lead some groups with me. And this was an idea that came from them to me to say, we really need a Black accountability for this process so that it doesn't become an echo chamber of whiteness, white people talking about whiteness all the time. And so first we would contract with a diversity and equity inclusion instructor, African-American man named Christian Friend, great name, but he's now in Chicago, but he held us accountable. And so what we came up with was both a financial accountability and a supervisory sort of pedagogical accountability. And with Black diversity, equity, and inclusion instructors. And Christian Friend was our first until he moved away. And so we would pay him for his time in holding the facilitators accountable. Even though these were white affinity groups for the most part, we've now had some groups where there have been a diversity of participants, even though the title of the course is, what does it mean to be white? People sign up, wanting to know from all different backgrounds. But because they're mostly white affinity groups, the facilitators tend to be people who are white. And so those facilitators, when they become a facilitator, are now required to meet with a Black diversity and inclusivity instructor monthly to make a contribution to their work. We as a church pay that diversity inclusivity instructor as well. And they hold us accountable for our own whiteness in our facilitation. So what we do is bring concerns and events that are happening within the groups that we're leading to these facilitation sessions and talk about them with the diversity and inclusivity instructor, who holds us accountable and will say, that's interesting that you're reacting that particular way to that issue that's coming up in your group. Here's some thoughts about how you might troubleshoot that differently. Here's some ways to think about what's happening in your group. And so the accountability from people of color on the outside is really helping to continually to inform the ways the groups are being led, so that we're not sort of separate off and segregated in this work from the Black community.
So part of the work for your praxis thesis was to do some contextual analysis, both of Myers Park Church and of the city of Charlotte. So can you talk to us about how you went about doing that work and what were the important things you discovered about both Myers Park Church and Charlotte?
Yeah, the contextual analysis took a lot of time because Charlotte is a very, very complex city. Even more complex now that it is at the point in the first time in its history where it has a Black mayor, a Black head of the county commission, a Black DA, and a Black chief of police. It's the first time in its history. And yet the life for Black residents has not necessarily changed all that much, even with Black faces in high places. So there's a lot of complexity there for white people trying to figure out what's going on in the midst of a city. And what I discovered in my own work with Charlotte is just a lot of blindness and denial of a history of white supremacy in the city. A pretty long history of white supremacy, not just beginning with the displacement and settler colonization. Trade in Tryon Streets, which is the center of Uptown, was an indigenous trading path. But starting there, and the displacement of the Catawba and Cherokee and many other indigenous nations was a continued pattern of religiously justified displacement. And then slavery, of course, was a huge piece of Charlotte because that's what made Charlotte the economic boomtown that it was cotton. And the mill communities around Charlotte, every little town around the city of Charlotte was basically a cotton mill town. And Charlotte was a boom area for cotton transportation. And that's really the heart of the city, which is now one of the largest banking centers in the world. The connections between slavery and the cotton capitalism and banking are important to make, and they were important for me to try to connect in my contextual analysis, because sort of the economics of the city and the colorblind racism of the city go hand in hand. And there's a lot of discussion now about upward mobility. Charlotte was listed in the Economic Opportunity Study by Harvard and Stanford as 50 out of 50 of cities in America for upward mobility, which means that if you are a Black person born in 1980 in Charlotte, you had and you were born in poverty, you had only a 4% chance of moving out of poverty in your lifetime, which was the lowest anywhere in the country. Of any major metropolitan city. And so we look at Charlotte, and this is where one of the activists in the city tells me that the state motto of North Carolina is to be and not to seem, but the state motto of Charlotte, or the city motto of Charlotte, is to seem and not to be. And so what is on the surface of Charlotte is this, economic juggernaut of upward banking capitalism, but it's for a particular segment of the population. It's asymmetrical. So white people are advancing economically, and many others are being left behind through practices of segregation that are left over from many years ago. The schools is a great example. And, Charlotte was in the 70s, the model for integration in many places after the Swan case. It became, through forced busing, one of the most integrated public school districts in America. Written up in books, it was a model city. And then because of a white father named William Capaccione, who couldn't get his white daughter into a magnet school because of a racial quota, he sued, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And they said that busing had served its purpose and everything was achieved, and therefore they turned it back, and now Charlotte is the most segregated school district in America. So I think these kinds of things that, they don't always appear necessarily as racially motivated on the surface, but the impact is deeply racial and has had dramatic consequences for the residents who live in our city. So kind of understanding the Charlotte way, as we call it here, which is to just sweep things under the rug and not talk about them and imagine we figured out all the problems and that everything's great. That also impacted the church a lot in its own social justice work as well. To imagine we were more deeply in the civil rights movement than we really were. To imagine we had overcome our racial animus more than we really had. To imagine we were further along than we really were. To imagine that race was gone, that we were in a post-racial society, that we could live in colorblindness at this point. All that affected the church's work as well. So, when I arrived, in the middle of Black Lives Matter moment in American history, right prior to the election of Donald Trump, their muscles had atrophied from years and years of this sort of post-racial moment that they imagined we were in. And so everything kind of smacked up against that really hard in 2016 with the murder of Keith Lamont Scott and the uprising that happened in the streets of Charlotte. And we all had a really rude awakening at that time and a thorough education.
Yeah, and who was it? Who was your guest preacher the Sunday after Donald Trump was elected, Ben?
Yeah, so I started in 2016. I like to joke that I started on the Sunday that the Panthers lost the Super Bowl and everything went to hell from there. And that's exactly what happened. And so middle of the year, we were in the transgender bathroom bill controversy. And then by the end of the year, Keith Lamont Scott had been shot. And then Donald Trump was elected, all in my first 6 months as pastor. And so I had invited Dr. Barber, who I met at another church, Dr. William Barber, to come preach on the Sunday after the election. And he and I had been talking. We're like, oh, you'll just come and do a victory lap. It's going to be fine. And of course, that's not what happened. And Donald Trump won. And he didn't want to come at first, but he did. And he came, and we had about 1,000 people there. And he preached for an hour and a half. A national sermon on race is what he called it. And it just blew the wigs back of everybody in our congregation. And we had a deacons meeting the next day. And I had deacons who were Baptist, lifelong Baptist believers in the free pulpit, who were trying to demand that I disavow his sermon in a public statement and sign a document that he'd never be invited to preach again, and just ridiculous stuff that was overturning their own most sacredly held convictions because of how much racial stress they had as a reaction to his sermon. So we spent the next few months trying to decipher why folks reacted that way until we got down to race, which took us a while, but we got there. But that was all before I developed. That was right before I started my work at St. Paul's. So that was informing that experience with a church that imagined itself to be very progressive. To have such a moment after Dr. Barber preached really informed my work. I mean, a lot of people in my colleagues imagine Myers Park to be the most liberal church in the South, literally. Not just a liberal Baptist church, the most liberal church in the whole South. And for us to still have white people reacting the way that they were to Barber meant that we hadn't made the progress that we needed to make. Hence the reason for some new process on looking at whiteness.
So let me just say that I do have a couple more questions I want to ask Ben, but we do then intend to open it up and have some conversations. So I hope as you are as you all on the board are thinking of questions, that you'll make a note to yourself and pose those. I'd like to ask you, Ben, to talk about how the DMin process itself works and the components of coursework, and then as you move into the praxis thesis and how that works. I'm sure some members of the board know that particularly well, but others may not. So could you
Yeah, so my experience of the doctoral ministry is certainly colored by the fact that I had already tried to do a PhD at Catholic University of America, and was ABD, finished all the coursework there, and I was in moral theology and ethics, and had not finished, and felt called into the church, and then became a pastor and did all that. So I was coming to it, with some skepticism about the level of academic rigor, I think. And I think I was coming to it with some concern about whether or not I would be intellectually stimulated, or all that kind of thing. I was also, I think, coming in with concern that I would find myself in the same place I found myself before, which was kind of lost on an island with no advisement, not able to finish, as happens to so many PhD candidates, as I've discovered. But that was not my experience at all. I remember very early on a coursework that was specifically focused around the writing of the praxis thesis and the teaching how to do qualitative research. I mean, that alone was so important. And those were like the first classes. I remember Elaine Robinson, who's written on race herself, so I'm just like feeling like I'm in her footsteps too. But just really hammering the process down and holding us accountable to doing the work of understanding how to do qualitative research. That was something I've never had before. I never had that in Masters of Divinity work. I had never learned how to do that well. And to have someone really there with me, kind of walking me through that process, holding me accountable, shaping and forming my ability to do that, and my understanding of how to do that well, was critical and crucial. I found that the coursework, even though a lot of it was virtual, was in fact quite rigorous, and was right on point. Selections of the books that we read. I'm thinking particularly of some of the courses I've had with Dr. Brandt and Dr. Sigmund, especially. And I know some of you might not know this, but Dr. Sigmund is a genius with Moodle. Nobody does Moodle like her. Anyway, videos, documentaries, pictures, art. I mean, the whole works on Moodle, right? So I think, and then I think the other thing that I had not been asked to do, my Master's of Divinity was at Duke, and then I went straight to do PhD work. So I had not been asked to, or forced to translate my academic work into the practical, hence the qualitative research. And I think having people like Dr. Brandt, Dr. Sigmund helping me figure out how to translate the high academic writing into something practical that's the gift of the DMin work that I did. I actually found it to be quite hard, not only doing that, but also having to reflect spiritually, personally, practically on the academic work. That tended to be the harder part for me. It was not hard for me to write on two scholars and their thoughts on, war, but it was hard to figure out what that meant for my church and for me personally. So that was the hard translating work. And then of course the praxis thesis itself is a whole nother process. That was it was a whole journey for me. I'm remembering the 200-page chapter, Dr. Brandt, that I wrote that we just scrapped, and just how much writing was required, at least for me, to get to the point where I felt like I could do something that was a really good analysis of what had occurred within the project that I had, and to do qualitative analysis on the reflections that people had in the process, and really make meaning out of what took place for the participants. That was a huge transition for me. It was a whole new skill set that I learned, and the DMin from beginning to end, from the practical courses in the beginning with Elaine, to the classwork and coursework through the middle, to the advisement that I had. Dr. Brandt was with me along the way for all the ups and downs. You know, and I think that really helped me to succeed as I went through. So I really appreciated the process. And I would, you know, I think the thing about a DMin is it's so different no matter where you go, right? I mean, it all depends on the location, on the school. But I'm a real believer in the program that you all have at St. Paul's.
Well, thank you for that endorsement. So how would you talk about, as you think about this whole process of your DMin, and what would you lift up as the most important things you've learned about ministry, about anti-racism work? And of course, that's a question you get asked at the end of the praxis thesis, because we want you to be self-reflective about you've gone through all this and what have you learned? It's kind of the large question. So what kind of reflections do you have on that, Ben?
It's a big one. You know, I think a lot of times in ministry, I personally, as a pastor, and I know others, underestimate the significance of the situation that they're in and the complexity of it, and just try to live through it without processing what's happening. And so what this journey, academic and spiritual, gave me was the ability to slow down and look at what was happening and process it with other people, and then to try to think critically about why things were happening the way they were in my context, how they got to be that way, what was the historical background, not to just assume I knew, right, but to do the work, and not to just assume that other people in the context knew either, but to work with them to see what they understood, and to tackle this problem, or to try to face the problem of white supremacy, systemic racism, more seriously than to just have another group discussion. You know, everybody comes to the fellowship hall and we're going to talk about Ibram Kendi's new book, right? Like that wasn't getting us anywhere. And this process really gave me a chance to try to come up with a program that could really create transformation. And so that was one of the things that I thought about. I also think that as a pastor, pastors don't have a lot of time to create something that is complex, like the process that I created. To have spiritual practice, meditation, confession, an autobiography, to create the kind of syllabus that I created that's not just slapped together, but intentionally thought through, and every section is built. Now we're doing it, we have movies for every one of those categories. So they're watching 13th when they do whiteness as property. So the thing that it has given me is the ability to create, it's a foundation that's created a scaffold that I can build on top of. I've now created a Spotify playlist that's also people of color singing about white people, and poetry that's people of color writing poetry about white people. And I'm able to use all these different things in this process because of the foundation I had that was enabled for me with the time and the intentionality around the coursework and the praxis itself, that I would not have had time otherwise to develop in my own congregation, and would have continued to imagine that the reason that there was no transformation was that my members were just dull. You know, there's just dull. They just can't get it, right? Not ever imagining that I might be part of the problem. That I might, either my own whiteness is getting in the problem, or my lack of time and intentionality to create something that would have transformative potential, that would have a research project that we could study to see if it was transformative first before we would implement it. So I think that's a great gift, and a gift that I think only the time and space of a DMin can give you in pastoral ministry. So I'm grateful for all that.
Thank you. So one final question, and then we'll turn it to the rest of the board and those present to see what questions they have. At St. Paul, we've taken a commitment to be intentional about anti-racism work. The board has done that, the faculty, the seminary as a whole. What kind of thoughts do you have for us as we continue? We've certainly started, but as we continue, what kind of thoughts do you have for us about doing anti-racism work?
Yeah, well, I have to say the first thing is that I discovered that white people can't do anti-racism work without talking about whiteness and confronting whiteness head on, first and foremost. And any discussion where we don't do that, we will approach it oftentimes paternalistically, as if we're doing a favor for our Black and brown neighbors. And we will approach it as detached subjects, imagining other people have race and that we don't. Or we will approach it as colorblind racists, imagining that, what's 400 years of slavery between friends? These are not healthy ways to approach the dialogue. And if we continue to approach it that way, we'll never make any progress. So the thing that white people have to do is just to learn to develop a stamina to look in the mirror that has been presented to us by people of color for a couple hundred years and longer, that is reflecting back to us the ways that we have harmed our neighbors. I think the thing that's been so transformative for me here is to go from thinking about race as like hatred, like in people's hearts, right? And to move, certainly hatred is there in certain cases, but that's sort of the result of racism. Racism really is just a lie that white people came up with to take power. Baldwin says whiteness is just a metaphor for power. And we created race to take power, and we use that power to steal land, steal people, steal labor, steal economically, steal politically, steal elections, steal political power, steal votes. It's just power. And power is something that the church has been trying to deal with since its beginning. The religious people have been trying to deal with since its beginning, since Jesus' disciples decided that they wanted to sit at the right and the left, and so there's power is always this question. And I think I would say when you focus on race, please make sure to think about whiteness. White people have to talk about whiteness and confront whiteness as the ideology that it is. And we also have to understand race is about power and not think of it in terms of just, hatred. It certainly is about sin and evil, but it's sin and evil related to power, not sin and evil related to the emotion of hate.
Thank you.